nothing new in what we're seeing, what's happening on the screen. It's repeating the lesson 1 and lesson 2 and things we've learned in lesson 3, but combining all those things together and making them into a final image. So what I'm doing here is I'm pretty much painting a environment that is looking very similar, and it's also almost based on Petropolis in Iran. And basically the technique that I'm trying to use here and experiment with is using lines and using those black shadows that we've discussed in lesson 1, and then painting them inside of grids and perspective grids. So what I try to do in the very beginning is getting a single point perspective and almost like a symmetrical composition, which means that our vanishing point is right in the middle of the image, but also having a little bit of that rule of thirds going on as well, because of how the construction lines, or the parts of what you see on the screen, the building parts and the columns, where are they placed, and exactly when you pay attention to a briefly another workflow, which is basically borrowing all the techniques that we've learned so far. There's specifically nothing new in what we're seeing, what's happening on the screen. It's repeating the lesson 1 and lesson 2 and things we've learned in lesson 3, but combining all those things together and making them into a final image. So what I'm doing here is I'm pretty much painting a environment that is looking very similar, and it's also almost based on Petropolis in Iran. And basically the technique that I'm trying to use here and experiment with is using lines and using those black shadows that we've discussed in lesson 1, and then painting them inside of grids and perspective grids. So what I try to do in the very beginning is getting a single point perspective and almost like a symmetrical composition, which means that our vanishing point is right in the middle of the image, but also having a little bit of that rule of thirds going on as well, because of how the construction lines, or the parts of what you see on the screen, the building parts and the columns, where are they placed, and exactly when you pay attention, you can see that the bottom of those columns are sitting almost on the lower third, and the tops, or an average of tops, is sitting exactly on the upper third, or the line that is dividing the middle and the upper third. So applying a rule of thirds technique here as well. I'm also applying a directionality of light, so I'm deciding where the light direction is coming from, but I'm not paying 100% attention to how to construct shadows, but rather sketch them out, because this is supposed to be a sketch exercise, and the basic idea was to use custom brushes to make it look almost like it's a pencil drawing, without using that canvas, that setup that we used in lesson 2. So a next thing that I try to do in those sketches is, obviously I'm using selections, which selections allow me to confine where the lines are going, and where the lines are stopping, and how those lines are going to look like. I'm also using vertical and horizontal lines to create shadows, instead of just values themselves. And then later on, I'm actually using values to change the overall read of the image, to make it even more in line with what it would actually look like in real life. And one decision that is critical here is that this is not the final result is not going to be a photorealistic look that you would achieve by just using values and using the light correctly. I still want to keep that sketchy feel to it, and only use values to create a little bit of that feel of texture, and maybe differentiate specific areas of the image, whether it's a ground and background, and maybe the structures themselves, those being using different values, and basically allowing me to make allowing my eye to actually see better and understand what's going on the image in a much better way. What else is important in this kind of workflow? Because I tend to like this workflow for just sketching when I have time to play around and create something interesting that is going to be inspiring. It's going to look like traditional sketch, but it's also going to be a constructive thing to be used for later production. So for instance, just the fact that I'm using lines instead of the values only is allowing me to get the better understanding of what shapes are and forms are in there, because lines will define the exact form without going too much into details, much better than if you would want to do it just by using values themselves. If you want to use only values to create forms, you kind of have to put extra work into it, because otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to have a very simplistic look to your image if you just only focus on the values and nothing else. If you don't put enough details in those areas where the values are, if you don't put the value grouping where there are differences, slight differences in values, you might miss out on opportunities of creating something that is that feels detailed and feels more elaborated. When you actually use lines, because you're creating a contrast by using lines, you're actually making the image a little easier to read. You don't have to put that much of an attention to perfect light that will construct exactly what you see in the image. The lines are constructing what you see in the image, and the values are enhancing the result. So when we go back to lesson 1 and we look at the sketches done in lesson 1 and how we use lines and just a very black color or one color shadow, you can see that if you enhance that with a knowledge of using values, you're getting much richer image without spending that much of an extra time, which is you can find quite a lot of use when you're creating sketches, when you're constructing things, and this could be a very valuable thing to work on, to work with this kind of technique, because if you go really in depth into how you use those lines and how precise you are with those lines, you can not only construct something that is going to be super clean and clear for 3D artists to build, because the lines themselves will define the shape, but also because you're enhancing it with values and different values, you're actually giving even that extra information and depth to what this image is going to be about. Finally, one thing that I like to do when I sketch that way is I always think about my sketching as a canvas for making mistakes. And one of the mistakes that I made here in the very beginning was changing the construction and perspective of one of the middle arches, or the middle columns, which I created specifically different perspective lines or different vanishing point for it. And quickly realized, or somewhere in the middle of the image, I realized it's actually not working that well. It's creating confusion, and it looks out of place. It looks out of perspective, even though it's constructed almost in a right way. So I do make those mistakes quite often, and if you do make those mistakes too, don't worry, they happen to everyone, and that's a good thing, because once you make a mistake, you realize something doesn't work, and because you realize something doesn't work, your mistakes stop at the image itself. They don't go further, and they're not replicated in much more costly environment, which is creating assets and then putting them in the game itself, and then dealing with the idea that something is just wrong and needs to be fixed. But hey, we actually spent so much time building those assets. How are we gonna do that? So treat your sketches, especially sketches, as a canvas to make mistakes, so that everyone else who's gonna use your work, your concept art, in later stages of production, will not have to make those mistakes for them. One thing that is really crucial is that your concepts can bear a lot of weight, and if they are followed directly, if you do them correctly and they are followed directly, the results on the screen are going to be amazing, because you as a concept artist, you are supposed to create visually stunning environments by working in a team with designers, so you can mix interesting game design and gameplay with stunning visuals that are directed by art director or game director, but you have the keys for the visuals because you are actually drawing them. You're actually creating the vision of how those things are going to present themselves in the game and how they're going to look like. And the only effort that you have to put into is just to paint it. It takes little time compared to what video games are taking as a final production. Video games usually span between a year if it's a remake or if it's some kind of sequel or something like that. But they can take almost up to 10 years. If there's obviously games that are taking 10 years are either huge in terms of the amount of content they have, or they've been just redesigned so many times, and those are the games that the concept art and the decisions made in the beginning are not working and are very costly. It just literally can take years to fix some of the mistakes. And when you, as a person who is supposed to inspire and build worlds together with the team, when your steps can and your foundation in terms of understanding architecture, your foundation in understanding how light works and how composition works, once you start adding those elements in your drawings and in your concept art and create a solid foundation for just an image alone, you can save quite a lot of money in the whole production cycle, because just your image alone can create a realization in eyes of 3D artists that, because like any artist, we even 3D artists or texture artists, they do have creative ideas. They want to have their creative input. But sometimes, because the specifics of the role are totally different, they're not designed when you work as a 3D artist, as a 3D character artist, or when you work as a background artist, when you create foliage, or when you work on textures. You're a specialist. You're the best at what you do, but you might not have the same expertise in terms of composition or in terms of construction or anything like that. So if you, as a concept artist, can create that solid foundation that anyone else can actually support and build upon, that's a success. That's a successful approach to be, or a successful position to be in, because not only your concept art is going to work great in the final product and will allow to possibly avoid quite a lot of mistakes, it's also going to create a confidence in terms of what the game is going to look like. Because if you can create a selection of concept art, and if you can constantly provide that strong foundation with backed information, where you can just clearly say, this is why I'm making this decision in the painting, and it's based on that knowledge that is bulletproof. Once you reach that level where you can say that, there's nothing that can stop you from helping the team. If you don't have that foundation, if you make those mistakes, if you avoid repeating or changing things on a concept stage, where you just get so tight and so close to what you do, and you don't want to change it because you love your image, you feel like this is the best thing in the world, But if it's missing that foundation, if something is wrong, it can cost a lot of money. You have to realize that. So as a concept artist, we bear the weight of possibly wasting money if we make wrong decisions, or if we interpret art direction or game direction in the wrong way, or if we create assumptions for, whether it's architecture or values or lighting direction or anything like that. When you create something, you are the expert in that field, and if your expertise has holes in it, then those holes will be exposed later in the production, and it can actually be very costly. But if you don't have those holes, if you have your grounds covered, you're not only allowing to save money or save production time, but you can also inspire other artists that might have had an idea that they thought was great, to not make a mistake of applying that idea, because it clearly doesn't work, because you as a concept artist already tested this idea and it doesn't work, and you eliminated it from your concept because you made those mistakes in the first place in your concept, and you use your concept as a canvas for exploration and failures, and learning on those failures and doing changes and constantly iterating and adding more things. So don't be afraid to fail. I'm gonna repeat myself again. Use sketching as a canvas for mistakes. If something doesn't work, start from scratch or change that, because it's much easier to fix that at that stage than elude someone into thinking that this is the right way, and then realizing that, okay, this doesn't work, and now we're a few months in, because assets creation can take a lot of time, especially if those assets are polished and very detailed. So that would be probably the most important thing when you think about combining those things together and working with this style, whether it's this style or just using values themselves, or just using lines as in lesson 1 and 2. It doesn't matter. All it matters is, it just, in any of those situations where you're not working weeks on creating some kind of amazing library of assets, you're allowing yourself to be a failure. You're allowing yourself to make mistakes and then learn from them, and then apply the lessons that you learn into something new, or into fixing what you've already created. All right, so we've discussed clipping masks, we went through gradients, we also went through a couple of techniques on how to make selections and what kind of selections are available in Photoshop, and how we can actually use them to create something interesting. What I wanted to talk about and kind of explore right here is paint a couple of things, and basically use those techniques, and only those techniques, in the beginning of our painting, to create shadows. Now, one thing that you need to remember is, whenever I'm creating this kind of painting, I'm always looking at a reference. Obviously, the reference itself is not visible on the screen right now, because I have a dual monitor setup. I'm using all my references, I have them on the second screen. So when I look at reference, what I'm trying to find is, I'm trying to decipher what exactly do I see. And the first thing I look at, and because we're talking about light mostly in this lesson, I'm trying to find where the shadows are. I'm trying to find the shapes of those shadows. The best idea is to squint your eyes when you look at reference, and then look at what the general shape of the shadow is and how it's constructing the environment within that photography or a reference or whatever you're looking at. If you're doing a plein air, it would be exactly the same exercise. You would squint your eyes to kind of get the general shapes, and then as you create the general shapes, you go further in and add more details. So this is exactly what I'm doing here. I'm using my lasso tool to create selections. And I'm creating those selections only for shadows. I don't care about any highlights. I don't care about any details like grass or rocks or anything like that. I'm caring only for what I see in terms of what kind of shadows are being cast with in that reference. So what I'm trying to achieve right here is I'm trying to create a slope of a mountain. It's a mix of rocks and grass, so it would be very barren, very sort of barren looking environment with a little bit of patches of grass and a little bit of that life coming in, but generally very dead, sort of rocky, mountain-like environment. And again, the main reason for me to search for shadows and to draw with shadows is basically whenever I make selections and whenever I can get the shadows in the first place, I can clearly see where the illustration or where this whole shape is going to. What I'm also trying to do is I'm examining how the shadows look like. I'm examining what is the structure that the shadow itself is casting. So for instance, if it's a rock, I'm looking at what is the shape of the rock and what kind of geometrical figures we could break it down to. Whether it's just sort of the deformed ellipse or sphere, or maybe it's a combination of couple of boxes or cubes that are just in different shapes. Imagine intersecting cubes. Imagine you put together 6 or 7 cubes. Each of them are different size. Each of them have a slightly different rotation in 3-dimensional space. Each of them would have different perspective lines or different vanishing points in the perspective itself, and combine them together. And now we can start to figure out, okay, my light is coming from the right side, so all the faces that are facing left would be in shadow. And this is sort of like this thinking process that I have inside of my head whenever I try to paint shadows, because I want to make sure that the shadows are in the right place. They're coming from the right direction. I don't want to have a situation where I'm painting something and I'm adding different objects to the scene, and then all of a sudden the scene has 5 or 6 different light sources that just don't match each other, especially when I'm planning to do natural light, which would be a sunlight. Another interesting trick that I like to use when I'm creating masks and selections, again, what we're doing here is I have my mask on the layer itself, and whenever I make those selections, I use that mask, and only make a painting or create selections and fill them up with whether it's black or white. In this situation, we have a black mask with or white would be represented for what's visible, and black is what's invisible. So whenever I make a selection and I invert and I do it inside on the actual mask layer, it allows me to create a mask for the shadow I'm trying to create. If I don't want to use invert, for instance, if imagine our layer would have not the black and white values, but our adjustment layer would have grayscale. So if it has grayscale and you want to clear it up and want to have perfect white, it's not going to be that easy, because inverting means you're changing, you're pretty much changing to the opposite value on the color wheel. So if it's white, it's obviously going to be black. But if it's let's say it's dark gray, then it's going to be light gray. It's never going to be white. So you have to pay attention to that. And if that's not available, you can make a selection and paint inside of it. I don't need to actually do that here because I have just perfectly black mask, and I'm just filling in with white color, which is just by using invert. And this is the simplest way of doing this, Control I. But if I had a situation where I wouldn't have a black color for my mask, I would actually use different techniques. One of them would be just painting in, obviously, which is the simplest solution, but also there are some techniques of filling the layer with color, which we'll discuss later. Another important thing that I'm also doing here in the very beginning, and again, I'm just constructing shadows here, and I'm just using my invert, Control I, making selections and kind of trying to create those organic looking shapes that would represent how the rock formations would cast shadows. And I'm just holding shift and doing those paintings or doing those selections, and then when I release shift and when I release my my pen, when I just lift it up from the screen, it allows me to create a selection, and then I can use invert to actually fill it in. And the material or the color that is going to fill in inside that mask is going to be the color of the layer itself. So in here we have a darker gray color or darker gray value that is basically filling in for what we see in the mask itself. But also because I want to have this a little more organic, a little more traditional sort of feel to it, much like we did with the sketches. I'm using texture brushes to create this effect of traditional kind of look. And I was doing that just, brief moments ago, when I would just pick up a brush and start painting on the actual layer, not on the mask layer, but on the actual layer. And when you look at the layer itself, and when you look at the mask, you can see that the mask itself remains black and white, and the layer actually has different values. And the values that are there is the default value that I've created by duplicating the background layer and making it darker, and then paint that is on top of it, which is made with custom brush. And this process is pretty much repeated throughout the whole picture. There's a couple of more techniques that I use here, but generally this technique allows me to do a very interesting thing, which is I can rely on the very precise selections and very precise shapes that I want to create without worrying about doing brush strokes or making brush strokes that kind of go out of control because I maybe are not paying enough attention, or I'm trying to do something really precise, but the brush itself, because it's custom, it doesn't allow me to do that, and then I have to use eraser to sort of refine the edges a little bit. When you actually draw, and when you use brush, or even if you draw on paper, you'll quickly notice that, or maybe you know that already, that every single stroke that you make is basically can ruin your image if you do the wrong thing, especially in traditional media. When you draw on paper, and if you're using inks, you have to be really decisive on where those ink strokes are going to happen. If you happen to make a wrong ink stroke, you can pretty much ruin your whole work, because it's just never gonna work again. Imagine you're painting something really important and you put too much ink in that area, or maybe the line is going to be too heavy, and it just destroys the overall impression. So working in Photoshop obviously allows you to fix those mistakes much easier, because you can use selections and then delete specific areas of the selection, or you can use eraser to erase the excessive amount of value or painting that you've did. You can use layers, so nothing is overlaying. If you do something wrong and you don't want to use that specific brush strokes that you made, you can just delete the layer, and that's it. You don't have to cry about having the ruined image that you worked so hard on. So obviously Photoshop gives you all of those options, and I like to kind of go further than that. I like to have even more control, especially when I'm sketching like this, especially when I'm using this very specific technique, which allows me to have a full control over what kind of shapes I want to use, where those shapes are going to be, where I can put the big shapes versus small shapes. I can dictate very small details by creating very minimal selections, very small selections. I can create a selection, use it to create a new value, whether it's by Control I, again using the layer mask, and doing an invert or painting inside, and then I can move that selection to another area and do the same thing without selecting again. So there's a lot of options, but the selection itself will confine the very specific value that you want to achieve, or you're putting into the image. And just because of that, it will allow you to have much better control over shapes and much better control over how shadows are looking. So there's a couple of more things I wanted to discuss. One thing is use of brushes and custom brushes inside of painting, and how you can get those custom brushes to create even more interesting results with the masks and themselves. So much like using masks and selections to create masks, and using a lasso tool, or using a polygonal lasso, or using marquee tools to create selections, and then use those selections to get those layer masks, you can actually do the same thing. You can get very interesting results when you use custom brushes and paint directly on the mask itself. Now, it's gonna work exactly the same. When you select the mask, you're gonna have two options. It's going to be either a white or black color in your color palette, and you can switch between those by pressing X. And when you do that, you can actually create more organic looking selection mask. You can or actually mask painted masks in this situation, because you're not using selection anymore. You're mixing in a very textured look into what you're gonna see in your painting, and there's two ways of doing this. Obviously, you can use the layer itself and then paint different value on that layer. But what if you want to have the same value that kind of goes throughout, and it's like this one value that goes through everything? You can do that when you have that when you paint directly on a mask itself. Then you're just keeping that one value that going to go across the whole image, but you can make it look very organic. Like the edges of this new layer are going to be more jagged or more organic or more textury looking, while the value of that layer is going to be consistently it's going to be constant. Basically, it's going to be very same all across. So and much like using textured brushes for getting this extra result inside the layer, and then you can even add those textured brushes on the layer itself. So not only you're getting more organic looking edges of that layer, but also you're getting the fill of that layer itself. The fill inside that layer is getting that little more organic look by itself too. Now, one interesting thing that you can see me doing is I sometimes have a half empty layer that I'm basically painting in, and the reason for that is sometimes I just want to start from scratch. I want to use a layer differently. I want to have this layer to have those elements when I paint. The painting itself might not necessarily be fully opaque, so create slight differences between that layer and the layer that is underneath in terms of what kind of values you're going to see, which might add this little grainy look, little textury look to your painting, and make it even that more interesting. The minus or the cons of using that kind of technique is obviously the fact that if you make a selection outside of the area in which the layer itself is painted, and then invert the mask and do that thing where you just press Control I and do invert black color to white color on the layer mask, you're not going to see any results because there are no pixels inside that selection that can be represented. So white means, again, representing pixels that are on the layer, and black means those pixels are transparent. So if there are no pixels, no paint inside the selection, there's just going to be no changes on the screen. So you have to be aware of that, and when you see that happening, it means that you have to just go on that layer, not the mask itself, but the layer itself, and then just start painting on top of it. And then you will see that when you're painting on top of it, your brushstroke is going to be confined within the layer mask itself. So that whole process is, although it might sound complicated, it's pretty easy. Once you start using it, and once you start doing it more often, you'll see that you don't want to stop. You will find so many different avenues to use that technique and to use that for your painting, not only because it's a very clean way of working, but also it allows you to do so many changes rapidly without destroying your image. You can duplicate that layer and do changes just inside your layer mask and make a dramatic change to your image without going in and over painting and trying to figure out, like, how am I going to keep this nice texture that I have here, or this textury look of my brush strokes, without changing that result, and maybe changing shapes themselves. So just having that separation where you have your layer, which has its own value, or maybe discoloration or different values brought by textured brushes, and then confining them within a mask, that's very powerful, and it allows you to do quite a lot of changes down the road, because you can expand the layer mask and delete the layer mask. You can use the same texture that you have painted on a different mask in a different area of the painting and duplicate, and it's just, you can go on and on and on. You can use gradients and whatnot. So it's a lot of things to play with. So we're going to now speed up this whole process a little bit, because the whole process, or all the techniques that we've been using so far are just going to repeat themselves inside the screen. And it's maybe worth a while to actually talk what kind of usage or in what cases you would use that technique, and what it makes sense, and why it's important actually to okay, so before we go into exact usage and in which cases this technique can be used and how far you should go, you have to realize this one very specific and very important thing, that much like any other techniques that we've discussed so far and we worked with, whether it was sketching or using gradients or anything like that so far, everything that you've learned from perspective to line drawing and sketching, through using gradients and custom brushes, you need to be aware how much time you have for creation of your images, and that by itself, if there are tight deadlines inside a project and you need to be sure that you finish something on time, that's going to determine how far you can go with that particular image. This sketch or this painting that we're working on here took me altogether about 90 minutes from start to finish. But generally, if I would work in a video games environment, I would probably mix it up with a couple of other techniques that we will discuss in the next lesson, with the usage of photography and more custom brushes, because it will just save me a lot of time, where I can just do a little bit of overpainting and using selections and everything that we're using here, but in combination of something that is already existing and is already shaped, and we don't have to go into every single detail to flesh out exactly what kind of environment we're painting or what exactly we have in mind when we're putting those selections into action. So let's discuss in what kind of situation we could use those techniques and this kind of style of painting. This is obviously a perfect technique for expressing mood, or doing sketches that will express a little more information and add a little more into the cauldron of ideas, where you can not only just show the shapes and forms that you have in mind for a very specific environment, but also suggest what kind of lighting this environment will have. Lighting is extremely important in when you draw sketches and when you draw mood sketches, especially because the lighting can define how this whole scene is going to be read. There might be levels, and there might be situations where the bad lighting can destroy the visual results that you're trying to achieve by creating interesting forms inside of your image. For instance, we're working here only with organic material. We're not using any kind of architectural style or anything like that. We're just creating nature, plein air or landscape painting, however you want to call it. And important thing to know is this can look amazing if it's lit correctly, or it can look extremely bad or very terrible regardless of what shapes you use if it's lit very badly. The sun direction and the light direction will matter a lot on how you read the scene, and it can also influence the story behind this whole scene. So for instance, right now we have a light that comes from the right hand side, and it's almost following the angle of the slope itself. So the angle of light is maybe slightly elevated towards in comparison with how the slope is following, in which direction it's following. So in this situation, what could be really interesting is, imagine if that was a pathway for a player to traverse, and imagine that players are supposed to go from point A, which is where the beginning of a screen is, or which is the point of view of the viewer of the image, and through the path behind that hill, that will be a point B. And let's imagine that there is an ambush situation, or there's an enemy that is supposed to attack a character, but we want to create a very dramatic situation here. And this is a perfect scenario, because the light is going to be almost directly behind those characters, or slightly above, which will create a very interesting look. It will basically outline or almost create a shape or silhouette of the characters, while killing quite a lot of details on those characters. And silhouettes on a very, very high contrast create very interesting, very dynamic, and very dramatic results. So that could be one example in which a correct use of light direction and correct use of color, or a correct use of lighting can affect how this image would look like. Now imagine if the light was in an opposite direction. It just, and the characters that are supposed to ambush would be somewhere in the middle of the slope, slightly going down. It would be impossible to see them, especially if you start adding colors and frequency of textures. They're just gonna blend with the environment. And again, that could be a solution. Maybe that's exactly what it's supposed to be. Maybe that's the plan. In that case, yes, then this is a right choice. But in most cases, in the situation we have here, when we want to create a very dramatic situation, a very dramatic ambush, or encounter, the right choice of light will determine whether it's a good mood sketch or not. So mood sketch or mood painting is an obvious choice here, an obvious reason to choose this style of painting or this style of work. What else this technique could be used for, and we don't see it in this very particular painting, is once you get to learn how to use those selection methods and painting, you can then work with it on pretty much any other style and use more techniques to apply into those techniques. And we're gonna learn that a little bit more in the next lesson, where we start introducing colors and photography. And we will borrow quite a few techniques from this lesson, where we're gonna use layer masks and selections and clipping masks as well. And you will see how much power this technique and this style of working can give to your paintings, regardless of whether it's just a sketch like this or if it's a fully finished painting. Another important distinction between what we've done so far and what we're doing here is obviously not using lines to outline or explain shapes. We're only using values to explain shapes. And this is a very important distinction, because in real life, there are no lines, there are no outlines around the objects. It just doesn't exist in nature. The way our eyes are perceiving objects is by contrast, by differences in value and differences in hues, which we'll discuss in the next lesson. So, but if we just look at the black and white images and we only look at the grayscale images, then a proper use of value can tell you whether the image itself is going to be dramatic enough or not. Remember that a lot of contrast is something that will always create more dramatic situations and more tension in the image. When you deprave image from the contrast, or areas of the image of the contrast, what you're creating is a thing called grouping values, which we've discussed before, which is allowing you to add quite a lot of details without putting quite a lot of emphasis in that specific area. Which means, for instance, that we can have a very rich environment. And when we look at this painting, we have a rocky formations, and we have a waterfall or water that is going under that kind of pathway, or this organic looking bridge built of stone or mud or whatever that could be. And we can quite add much more information without depraving the image from where the focus is, and depraving the image from the proper composition. The contrast itself and the way we're using contrast and the way we're using value will determine what we are looking at in the first place. But you have to remember this, that even if you create a very compelling sketch from just contrast alone, it will only have its very own first impression, and you want to create layers of impression inside your image. You want to make sure that when you go into those low contrast areas where you're grouping values, you can still see quite a lot of details. And when you stop by as a player, for instance, there's so many games where when you just look around, stop by and look in the corner, and there's quite a lot of details there. And it's not distracting because it's on a very low value contrast. Maybe there's a larger hue contrast that allows you to see the differences between objects, or maybe different shading of specific leaves, or maybe the wall itself it looks more weathered or damaged. But the damage itself, it's not so contrasty or substantial to take away what this image is supposed to be about. So and that's the biggest change and the biggest difference between value painting and using sketches or using lines to determine what kind of objects we see in a scene. Because what's going to happen is lines that you place on a white canvas, even if you make it light gray, but you're using black color to create outlines of what what this environment is composed with or composed of, that alone is a large contrast between the black color and the background, which is usually brighter. And that contrast means your eyes will travel all around and will be confused. It will be totally different read than you would have by looking at the value painting. So that's probably the most important part from the technical point of view when you think about mood painting or using values for this kind of stuff. And again, from game development point of view, mood paintings or value paintings can create a very interesting mood and direction in which you're going when choosing light, when choosing the direction of light, and how this light is affecting the values of the image, can make or break the best environment. So if you can construct the best environment ever, the most interesting environment ever, but you can kill it if you use your values and lighting in the wrong way. So lesson here, and sort of like a summary to think about when you go into your own your very own value drawings, is pay extra attention how you use lights, and pay extra attention how you group values, and try to start with shadows, because when you shadows themselves will create the most contrast in the image compared to everything else that you see there. And once you have a proper structure of shadows in your image, when you can make sense of what you actually see just by looking at shadows, and it works nicely as a composition. It works nicely without, in terms of leading your eyes towards a very specific point in which you're supposed to look at. Once those things work, and once those things are balanced correctly in your image, and once you decide which lighting direction will actually make sense for that scenario or that story element that is supposed to be explained in that painting, once all of those things are in place, then everything else will be much, much, much easier to achieve. And this is a critical, not only for value paintings and then black and white paintings, but also for any kind of painting that you're going to do later on, which is using colors or photography, or even using 3D elements to build and paint on top of them. So that will be sort of the most important part when we just look at the summary of this lesson about, get the structure of shadows correctly, and then if you do that very well, then everything else will be much easier. So pay attention to lighting and pay attention to shadows, and build your composition based of that alone, because if that's going to work great, then it's going to be much harder to destroy the image or make the image look way less impressive just by adding details. And you can always roll back on maybe scaling down on where the details are, or maybe scaling down on the contrast of some of the details that you're working on.